Been very clear and starting right at the start of this election campaign that we're going to have a fiscal anchor. We're going to be very clear about how we spend and borrow, and it's always going to be controlled. And that is a huge difference to where Labour is. Huge difference.
The old fiscal rules have gone, though, haven't they?
We will be changing the fiscal rules, and I've been clear about that. I said actually that this would change at the last spending round, and the reason to do that is because of the hard work of the British people over the last 10 years. Our economy is much stronger. We now are looking forward to a decade of renewal, and as we do that, we can afford to invest more. But that investment has to be controlled. I want to see more investment in things like roads and rail and broadband, but it has to be controlled, and that's what I've set out in my rules. So we've set sensible limits, which means, by the way, that under our plans, debt at the end of the Parliament would be lower than at the start, which is hugely important. And with Labour's plans, they will be spending hundreds of billions of more, and this will all come through borrowing, and debt will be totally out of control.
You mentioned Labour plans. You've got this extraordinary figure of £1 trillion pounds all over the papers at the moment, but it's basically bogus numbers and it's dodgy accounting.
Not at all. What we've set out today is the true cost of Corbyn's Labour. It's an additional, if I may, it is. I'll tell you where it's a true cost, and I'll tell you where it's come from. It is additional spending planned by Labour over the life of the next Parliament, if they win the election, of £1.2 trillion. That's some £650 million extra a day, or something like the entire NHS budget for 9 years. That's what they're planning. And where we've got these numbers from, let me tell you where the numbers come from. And your viewers, by the way, they can look for themselves. They're sceptical. They're very welcome to look and see exactly how we've reached this number. They can go on costofcorbyn.com, have a look.
Let's come through why I put you that this is bogus accounting. First of all, you've taken all Labour conference pledges and assumed that the Labour Party is going to implement them immediately in power, which is crazy. I mean, for instance, you've assumed that they're going to obliterate all private schools and put the cost of that straight in. And they're not going to do that. They've made that absolutely clear. That's one example.
What we've done is, first, we've taken their manifesto from a couple of years ago, which they still stand by, unless if they've withdrawn a policy, we haven't taken that into account.
You haven't counted it properly. You haven't costed the 2017 pledges fairly.
We have every single costing in this dossier that we've published today is either come from Labour's own figures. Most of them, actually, over 50% of the costings are from Labour's own figures. The rest of them have either come from independent external sources, and in some cases, yes, we have had to work them out ourselves, but we've done that in a reasonable way, and we've set out exactly in the document how we've done this.
But you've assumed that everything that they have as an aspiration is going to happen right at the beginning of the Parliament every single year. So, for instance, the 4-day week is suggested that they're going to do this on day one, which they're clearly not. I'm just putting to you, you've actually been very unfair on them. They have, in the past, not only produced their spending plans, but they've also said how they're going to raise the money in their so-called grey book. And yet you haven't included in your numbers how they say they're going to fund their plans.
This is the true cost of Corbyn's Labour. These are the numbers that John McDonnell did not want you to see. And they're out there today. They're there for everyone to see. Of course, John McDonnell, Jeremy Corbyn aren't going to welcome these numbers. They don't want to see this kind of transparency. This is these are eye-watering levels of spending. 1.2 trillion. Well, it will be absolutely reckless and will leave this country with an economic crisis within months, not years, within months.
Luckily, we are here to talk about your plans rather than about their plans. Can I ask, is the pledge made by the Prime Minister during the leadership campaign that he was going to raise the level for higher rate tax from £50,000 to £80,000, effectively a big tax cut for better off people? Is that going to be in the Conservative manifesto?
We will set out our plans during the course of this election campaign. When we publish the manifesto, you'll see what we've got to say on tax. But what I've already said, and I said just last week, is that with our plans, because they are properly costed, and by the way, whether it's a tax pledge or anything else, we will be clear about how we will be funding that, and that will be absolutely inside our fiscal rules. We'll be able to show people that we can both have tax cuts and have spending on what I call the people's priorities, on the NHS, on crime, on schools, and we can invest in infrastructure for the future.
Are you going to raise the threshold for national insurance contributions?
I'm not going to set out the entire manifesto today, but these are all good questions, but we will, during the course of this campaign, say exactly what we're going to do with tax.
The reason I'm asking you about that is not to do with the manifesto, it's just that these are pledges by the Prime Minister. He said this is what we will do. And therefore, above all, the higher rate threshold rising from 50,000 to 80,000, he has said this several times. This is what the Conservatives are going to do. And it's interesting, we've got the Chancellor of the Exchequer here, unable to tell us now whether that's actually true or not.
Well, it's not that I'm unable. We have, during this campaign, we know exactly what we're going to say and when, and I want to sort of stick to that. But I am clear. You know, one of the reasons I'm a Conservative in the first place is that I believe in low taxes. I believe that people should keep more of their own money. We as a government should only be taking strictly what we need to fund world-class public services. But to do all this, to make all this work, we also need to keep our economy strong. You know, over the last 10 years, the people have worked hard. The economy is a lot stronger, and it's ultimately that strong economy that pays for all these public services.
You seem uncannily more familiar with Labour's unpublished manifesto than your own manifesto. What about inheritance tax?
I'm not going to get into individual policies today. You know, what we have set out today is this true cost of labour, which is something for anyone you can look at. They can, again, go on costofcorbyn.com and see this for themselves.
Let's look at the cost of the Conservatives in that case. Is it the case that you want to spend an extra £2.8 billion on hospital trusts?
We will actually...
You've announced all of this, so you should know.
We are spending a total of £34 billion extra on health over the next 3-4 years.
Right.
And it's going up each year. And again, we can afford to do that as a country because our economy is strong. It's the strength of that economy that is allowing us to do that.
And you're increasing welfare spending by £5 billion and spending on roads by £25 billion.
We are actually our total infrastructure spending. You've mentioned a roads budget. We also want to make sure we're investing properly in rail and other types of infrastructure. And what I've set out already is that we can afford this investment, but we do have to have fiscal rules that make sure that your borrowing and spending do not get out of control, and that's exactly what we will have.
You're turning on almost every spending tap you can see. You say you can fund it. How are you going to fund it?
So the rules that I've set out in the last few days is that, first of all, what I'd call day-to-day spending, current spending, will always be in balance. We'll make sure...
I'm sorry, I'm going to stop you there, because the IFS says that we are going to be spending more than we're bringing in for the next few years by £50 billion a year.
I think, first of all, that probably includes capital spending as well, not day-to-day spending. I don't recognise the 50 billion number, but I'm sure
it's huge.
That's it. So what I'm talking about...
There is a huge deficit in the next few years under your own plans.
If you allow me a second to explain, day-to-day spending, what in technical terms the IFS and others will know as resource spending, will be in balance. So we'll make sure what comes in through taxes matches what we spend on day-to-day departmental activities. Then when it comes to capital spending, so that's things like investing in roads and rail and flood defences, these kinds of important things. We'll make sure that that is funded properly, and some of that we will borrow more. And I've set out that we might borrow up to £20 billion more to fund this capital investment. But we can afford to do that because we've set out the rules that will operate to allow us to do that.
I'll come on to the capital side in a moment, but on the current spending side, as it were, you have agreed that you're going to spend a lot more money, billions and billions and billions of pounds in all sorts of areas, year after year after year. We've just discussed that. And you've also said that that's going to be balanced, presumably by... So there's going to be higher taxes to pay for that money.
No, not at all.
So where does the money come from?
So if we look back a few months when I set out my spending round, that was an increase of £13.4 billion a year. And let's remember, before that, the previous Chancellor had said there was headroom, what he called headroom, of around 27 billion. I chose to spend half of that in a controlled way to spend more on NHS, on crime and schools in particular. And as a result, that spending is within the amounts that we take in the tax, so we can get that current spending and keep it under control. But when it comes to capital spending, that is different, and we will borrow more for that so we can invest in the future. We can have this renewal for the country. But, to do that, we need to do it in a controlled way. What we've heard from Labour this week is they
let's
will
not
have
get
no
on to Labour. Let's not get on to Labour
spending.
again. Some of these words are quite unfamiliar to people watching. When people talk about headroom, what you're really talking about is the economy growing, taxes coming in, allowing you to spend more. Yes? The problem that we have in this election is that you have refused to publish any guidance on what your Brexit deal is going to mean for this economy. Well, so we're going to a blind election economically. You're not telling us what your deal, the Prime Minister's deal with the EU, means for economic growth in Britain.
Well, what is happening to growth in Britain?
Why not?
I mean,
Why are you not telling us?
Let me please allow me to answer. First of all, our economy is strong, our fundamentals are strong, but you're right to raise the impact of Brexit, especially Brexit uncertainty on the economy. It's why we are in this election, by the way. We didn't want to have this election. We're having it because of the paralysis that we are seeing in Parliament. And it is only the Conservatives, if we get a majority, we're the only party that can deliver a deal and get Brexit done. All other options lead to Labour, and Labour will not only have one more referendum in 2020, they will have two referendums in 2020.
Those are the Labour attack lines.
Think of the chaos that will cause and what it will mean for the economy.
Those are the familiar Labour attack lines. I need to bring you back to the whole Brexit business, because if the government will not publish their own assessments of what this deal will mean, we have to look at what's been published in the past. And the nearest is a free trade agreement area, which will cause an eye-wateringly big 72 billion hit on borrowing over the next few years, again, according to the government's own figures. Now, they're a year old, but they're the only ones we've got to go on. So we're talking about something like a £72 billion in extra borrowing because of your deal.
That's not right. And so,
why is it not right? What is the figure?
Because I mean, first of all, regarding the deal, the deal in front of Parliament right now is had been, up until it was dissolved, was the withdrawal agreement. And alongside that, we published a full impact assessment. Now, you're talking about the future arrangement, where we do want a deep, best-in-class free trade agreement with our European friends. And if you want to look at what kind of assessments have been done of that, you can look at last week's Bank of England analysis. Look at the Bank of England analysis where they assumed...
So what's the figure for extra debt? What's the figure for extra borrowing?
The Bank of England assumed that this deal, the one we've set out, would be the one that actually happens. And in their analysis, they show growth every year. In fact, they show growth rising to 2% within 3 or 4 years, which is something we haven't seen as a country for a while. They show us growing faster than most of our G7 competitors, and that is just one analysis. So these numbers that you've set out, I don't recognise them.
Well,
what I am confident about...
You see, I'm sorry, Chancellor, the problem is this. You say, I don't recognise them, at the same time as you are not giving us any public forecasts at all for your own policies, which is why I say we're going into this election as a blind election economically. We have to take it on trust that the economy is going to do well after the Prime Minister's withdrawal agreement deal. We have no numbers for this. The previous government produced the numbers, and you won't. And I'm asking you again, why not?
We have been very clear that the way to move forward now when it comes to Brexit is to get a deal done. What is holding the economy back is the uncertainty. And everyone accepts that once you remove this uncertainty, it allows the whole country, the economy, to move forward. And the only way we get this deal done is with a Conservative majority government. And for those people that want to know how our economy will perform, the answer is we must get Brexit done and remove this uncertainty. And by the way, in this election, if we get that majority, we remove a double whammy of risks. Not only the uncertainty over Brexit, but also the uncertainty over Corbyn and Labour.
Talking about uncertainty, part of your big pitch is that the Conservatives have treated the economy so effectively and done so well you can turn the spending taps back on again. But actually, if you look at overall debt, £1.8 trillion now, way up in the league table, much, much higher than Germany, much, much higher than Ireland. And that may be why Moody's, for instance, the very important global credit rating, have looked at us and downgraded Britain. They've downgraded Britain for, and this is their words, not mine, they say, paralysis in policy making and no clear plan from election promises, including yours.
It's never good for any country to be downgraded. And I'm glad you've pointed to the actual report and what they've said. And the number one thing they point to is this paralysis in decision-making, and that is coming from what was a very dysfunctional Parliament. The biggest economic issue facing this country at the moment is the uncertainty over Brexit. Moody's has recognised that. And
if you
again, to remove that uncertainty, we need to have a Conservative majority, because any other outcome in this election will not remove uncertainty over Brexit.
And you're talking about higher spending now. But the trouble is, you're talking about higher spending to make up for the problems that you created in the first place as a government. So, for instance, an extra 20,000 police officers to replace the 20,000 police officers you got rid of before. And so on with education spending and spending on local authorities and all the rest of it. It's a bit as if you'd come to me 10 years ago and taken my raincoat away, and I've spent 10 years cold and wet, and then you tap me on the shoulder now and say, great news, I've found you a raincoat.
Well, it's worth recalling back in 2010 where our economy was. We just had gone through the deepest recession in almost 100 years. We had a budget deficit that was equal to 10% of GDP, the highest of any industrialised economy. And we had to, of course, at that time, we had to come in and repair the damage, and it required some tough decisions.
Did you do it well, do you think?
That hard work that the Conservative government and the British people have put in has paid off. But no one wants to go back to those days. Every Labour government has left this country with an economic crisis. Right. Corbyn's Labour would be no different. And what took Gordon Brown 13 years to destroy this economy, it will take Corbyn's Labour less than 13 months.
So now it's an election, and now you're spending and borrowing more again. I'm going to give you one last quote, which you will recognise, because it's by a certain Sajid Javid. You said, "My background taught me valuable lessons. It taught me that you need to plan ahead. It taught me you've got to live within your means. And it taught me you can't spend money you don't have." You need to go and talk to that Sajid Javid, don't you?
Well, it's the same Sajid Javid. Anyone who listened to my speech last week would say that's exactly the principles and values that I set out. And let's be clear, at this general election, the choice is very clear for the British people. It's either Corbyn's Labour and two damaging referendums in 2020 and reckless levels of debt, or it's the Conservatives delivering and getting Brexit done, focusing on the people's priorities and unleashing the country's potential.